Hello and welcome to Our Punch Drunk Loves, a podcast celebrating the films we adore. This is a slightly irregular episode. You may have noticed it's been a while since on my end, and generally busy work life getting the next episode out with a guest had. But we're in July now, so what I have done is enlisted my good podcast pal of Safe Room and Genre Haze fame to go through our personal top 5 movies of the year so far. So please welcome Jay. How you doing, Jay?
Hey man, doing well. And I always cherish the opportunity to chat about film with you. Our sort of introduction to one another many years ago. And while we do a gaming podcast on a weekly basis with one another, it's always a pleasure getting to chat about film because that was kind of like our first bonding place, right, with film and genre and whatnot. And so, yeah, looking forward to chatting about some of my favorites of the year so far and seeing what kind of surprises maybe you got on your list because I'm sure there's a few that similarities and whatnot, but that's kind of the best part about coming together, putting your heads together, and seeing what films really stood out to you and other film fans alike.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be an interesting list for sure, I think. I'm generally going on UK releases here. So obviously stuff that came out this year here. Sometimes that we do get cursed with that, where our stuff comes out like a half a year or a year later. Thankfully, not often in the case of this time. But I've also watched some festival movies, and they won't be noticed anyway. But just to keep that in mind for the end of the year, that should they come out, then maybe I'll include them in the list, or at least an honourable mention. And of course, I reviewed some US only movies at comingsoon.net. So it's a bit loose on the whole 2024 thing, but for somebody, it came out in 2024. That's what matters most. And as of recording this, according to my letterbox list at least, I've seen at least 70 movies or so from this year. Admittedly, very few of them are big theatrical releases, and a lot of them are horror based, as that's been my job. But that's understandable, I think, with everything we're going on. So, Jay, we're going to do honourable mentions first. A quick selection of things outside your top 5 that deserve a shout out. Not necessarily the 5 that come after it, but some films that you've just gone and looked and gone, oh yeah, you know what? I'd really like to give that a shout out, maybe, and see what tickles your fancy. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, a couple of my favorite films that I've seen so far this year would be first and foremost The First Omen, and
yeah, I've still not seen that one.
yeah, a film that I was surprised at how much I ended up liking that one because it is falls into the pre-sequel reboot kind of camp, and I wasn't a huge fan of that last remake that they did, and so this one really took me by surprise. Just the fact that the sort of directorial style, a really like surprisingly gorgeous looking film with some really stellar cinematography. So First Omen definitely is the biggest standout I think from my honorable mentions, but some other genre fare, stop motion, Monolith, The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, Civil War, Hitman, which is on Netflix, not to be confused with the Timothy Oliphant series, and In a Violent Nature, and last but not least, a film called One More Shot, which was a sort of DTV action film starring Scott Adkins that was a continuation of One Shot, which came out probably 3 or 4 years ago. This one kind of got quietly released, and just another really strong sort of DTV showing that doesn't have the kind of marketing behind it. That's unfortunate because it had some pretty stellar action as sort of like a throwback to like a 90s action programmer. So that's probably the honorable mentions of films that really stood out to me the most so far this year.
Yeah, I'll give a quick mention out to a couple of festival things that haven't come out first, or coming at least. Lucky Lou, which is a found footage movie, pretty much entirely in the view of the person who's a bit of a deviant, and them basically daring themselves to go closer and closer and closer into these people's homes, and obviously it taking these big consequences, and a really good use of found footage in that regard. Having a real reason for this person just having the camera around them at all times with these scenes. Um, Cannibal Mukbang, which, title being what it is aside, is a strangely sticky, sweet, romance, but also very dark, obviously, at the same time. And yeah, that was a real, knocked me out of the park on that one. Molly and Max in the Future, also rom-com, but like a low budget, sci-fi sort of thing in the background where they just these couple meet at different points in their little relationship and with different things happening each time. And so it's kind of like a typical meet cute, but all this weird sci-fi shit's happening as they go along, and it's like a nice little gem. But I still don't think it's got like a wide release. um Beyond that, a lot of genre fare. I would go anything from like The Coffee Table, which I think, shock value aside, I think is quite fascinating as like a really, really dark farce, in what it does. Lisa Frankenstein, I I genuinely think is a lot better than people have sort of been ragging on it for. I think it's just that same joyful thing that Jennifer's Body was, in terms of like having that sort of Diablo Cody pep and piss and vinegar sort of vibe, and I love that about it. There was Double Blind, which is like an Irish psychological horror, I would say. Kind of takes Nightmare on Elm Street's idea of like if you fall asleep, you'll die sort of thing, but in a very more clinical sense, and kind of mixes that up with like the claustrophobia of like John Carpenter's The Thing. And yeah, I found that really fun. Obvious ones such as Longlegs, Furiosa, as you said, Hitman, and The Moor, which was like it's set on the Yorkshire Moors, and it's just like this fictitious thing of like kids disappearing and there being some sort of weird satanic reasoning behind it. Could make a decent double feature with Longlegs in terms of like thematic things, but even though they're very different films. So yeah, that is the extent of the films outside my top five. I could go on for far longer, but I think that'll do on those ones. Right then.
That's the thing. I tried to cap my my honorable mentions at whatever a little more under 10, just because otherwise this is going to be a 3-hour podcast.
I know that's it. I just look further down the list and go, well, I can't mention that. But yeah, I'm that's what Letterboxd is for, after all, to review everything. So, should we start with your number 5?
Yeah, my number 5 is Infested from director Sebastian Vanecek, and this was a blending of a creature feature with apartment horror, which are two of my favorite horror subgenres, in which a young man buys what is essentially like a black market spider that's from the Middle East. It's brought over to France. He brings that into his apartment complex because he collects critters and whatnot and different types of insects. And naturally, it gets loose and it basically causes an infestation in an apartment complex that then begins, those spiders use that apartment complex as a feeding ground, basically, for the unfortunate residents that find themselves trapped in there. This is one where, it was funny when I covered this film with my co-host Stuart Garris on Genre Haze. We were trying to think of a number of spider-centric creature features that we really liked, and we found that while there's numerous of them, there really aren't that many that we thought were actually good or even entertaining. Obviously something like Arachnophobia is kind of the go-to and what I would consider the creme de la creme of spider creature features. But outside of that, it's more about how ridiculously large you can make the spiders and things like that. And, Infested, I thought, did a really great job of pacing it in terms of the spiders, where they make the sort of transition from where the spiders originate to then finding themselves in France and the infestation, how that begins and how that spreads. That whole aspect of it, I thought, was really well done because it feels very grounded in terms of, they're not larger than life. They're not sort of leaping around right from the jump. It's just very subtle how an infestation would probably go. And then as the film sort of escalates and its pacing, then it becomes, more of the creature feature centric. they start to get larger, they start to have an ability here or there, those types of things, the rate at which they can breed and everything. And yeah, there was a great emphasis too on blending practical effects with
Mm.
CGI, which I wasn't aware of the first time I watched the film. And it's why, the spiders themselves look so fantastic, because they used, I believe it was like 200 huntsman spiders, which are big as fuck to begin with, and then sort of modified them with CGI to give them that extra, more sinister look to them. And it's a film that I'm consistently surprised at just how good it looks, whether it's the spiders or just in general, how they shoot the apartment, how they really kind of pry into those nooks and crannies that, anybody that's lived in an apartment knows about. And yeah, it's a film that I watched it twice by myself. And then when it came out on Shudder, I showed it to like 3 different groups of friends. And every single time it played like gangbusters with the group. It was a ton of fun. Majority of people, can't stand spiders. So it's that type of film that really like preys upon that primal fear that I feel like a lot of people have with spiders. But it just, yeah, it looks fantastic. And the more that the infestation sort of grows and escalates, it becomes a lot more fun in a way that, horror sickos like myself and yourself really appreciate, I think.
Yeah, I think the main thing the film does really well is just keep this sort of uncomfortable, creepy, crawly nature to it throughout. Which, if you're making a spider horror film, you really need to tap into that beyond just like here's a spider sort of thing, which I think is the
Right.
failing of many a sort of spider film. In the same way that shark films, generally get it wrong by not understanding what makes a shark a terrifying prospect, and it's not always just about the shark. It's just about what you don't see and what is unseen. And in a way, that's kind of true with spiders. They're small generally. They get into places they could just be there, and you don't even realize. And the idea of just that many of them is kind of disconcerting, to say the least. I think the scene where they're having to go through that corridor where with the automatic light is like
Mm.
a fantastic set piece in terms of like creating tension. Yeah, and because you're working through the logistics of it in your head, like, well, who's going to do what? How are they going to get through? Because the rules are still kind of loose at that point on what the spiders will do. Will they will just attack? Will they fall down? Will light be enough light to keep them away? And that sort of ambiguity kind of keeps that tension going. And I think it's probably the best example in the film. I think of like channeling what makes the idea of that many spiders with this seriously deadly bite just the most horrifying kind of way that it could be. So yeah, it is a really fun spider movie. I think it does get that sort of mean streak, slightly, very slightly goofy weirdness to it that I think is going to really suit this director perfectly for when he does his Evil Dead spin-off. It's like I
Mm.
said to you in the past, when we talk about this, I said, this is the director that should have done Evil Dead Rise, because he shows us how to
Mm.
do proper
Mm-hmm.
apartment horror. And it's like, in a way, does a lot of the things I kind of wish Evil Dead Rise had done in terms of like going floor to floor and having to battle through lots and lots of deadites would have been like fantastic. But I understand why Evil Dead Rise didn't do that. But yeah, if you can ratchet up the kind of tension and unease that this does with that sort of giddy mean streak, I think it's going to be a special time indeed. Yeah, that's a solid pick, that one. Yeah, I enjoyed that film too. Okay, so for me and my number 5, ooh, here we go. It is Riddle of Fire is my one, which is strangely not a horror film. I think that's going to be a strangely true thing of most of my list, I think, at this point. But this is a debut feature from Western Razuli, which is a great name. Um, and it is basically, I think I saw someone describe it as like it's the closest thing they'd seen to like a live action Studio Ghibli film. Not in the sense of how fantastical it is and, going really hard into fantasy, but in depicting childhood and lost summers and things like that.
Mm.
And I really think it does a fantastic job at that. It's got child acting that is interesting in places. There's a kid who has a French accent speaks like he's about 30 years older than he is. He seems like he's about six, but it's like it's kind of works. It's just the same weird vibe going around where it's all based on these three kids who steal a video game console so they can play video games all summer. But the two of the kids, their sick mother won't allow them unless they go and get a slice of blueberry pie she really likes to help her make her feel better. And if they do that, they can have all the video game time they need. Well, some at least. And yeah, so simple job. But it turns out to be something of an epic quest where they can't find the pie, can't get there, have to go onto these different places to go and find it. And it's all very big countryside where they live. So it's like every door to door is basically like having to cycle for a few miles to find the next person. And they get caught up with these bunch of poachers who are like almost portrayed like they're some sort of satanic cult, but in a really loose sort of way. Um, and despite these relatively small scale stakes in this, they are made to feel huge. And there's this endearing quality to the trio's conversations that makes it feel like we're sort of dropping in to these chats between lifelong pals with their own sort of group logic and mannerism. I think the thing about this film is it made me nostalgic for a summer that was never mine, which I think is probably where you definitely get the most Ghibli sort of vibes with this one. And yeah, it's surprisingly dark in places, but also really twee. And it kind of reminds you of like Wes Anderson stuff to a certain degree, but very much more European, if you know what I mean. It just has that sort of sensibility. And yeah, I can see how it's made some people bounce off because the kid acting is a bit hit and miss. But I think they feel more genuine because they don't feel like actors. They feel like a bunch of pals just palling about. And yeah, I really like this film for that. It was probably the greatest surprise that I think I've had this year. It sort of just came into it out of the dark. Oof, great stuff.
If any film that has kids in it, and you could pay it the compliment of, it feels like a summer from, that you could relate to on some aspect, or, just the fact that it's like, oh, this feels like a missing chapter from my own experience in a way. Like that's probably the best compliment that you could give a film. And, the shout to Studio Ghibli is fantastic as well. Just like kind of nailing the aspect of adolescence and it being one that's not overly like sanitized, right? It's like, it's not afraid to show kids getting in trouble, kids doing stuff they're not supposed to be doing, which is all part of, growing up. And when you have something like this, and I'm watching the trailer as we're talking about it, it's just like something that seems very different in terms of like an experience I might have had growing up, but at the same time, like there's bits and pieces that I see that I can relate to and whatnot. And yeah, this is something that I'd never even heard of before you mentioned it. So it's definitely on my radar, and I just added it to my my Amazon watch list.
There you go. I've spread the gospel a little further today. So yeah, as anyone.
And Rizzulli is a fantastic director last
Yeah,
name.
it is. Yeah, it's just he's in the film as well. It's just like he looks exactly like you'd think someone called Weston Rizzulli would be. So even before I knew it was him, I think that sort of came into my head that maybe it was. Okay, so we are on to your number 4.
My number 4 is Furiosa, a Mad Max saga. Yeah, so, no surprise, massive fan of not only Mad Max Fury Road, but just the Mad Max series in general. That was like a big formative film for me. My grandfather showed me like that original trilogy over the course of an evening back in the day when I was like a very, very young kid, because we used to stay up till like 4 a.m. sometimes watching movies. It was a lot of bleary-eyed mornings, but, well worth it, I think, in terms of just the influence that he had on my interest in film and whatnot. And, it was the type of thing where we waited so long for Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, to come out after, almost a decade post Fury Road. And when you have a film that's as strong as Fury Road and is, untouchable, I think, in a lot of ways, when you talk about just concise, really, over the top action that is executed on flawlessly in a lot of ways, and it begs the question, like, how do you follow that up in a meaningful way? Can you even do that? And for me, I found that Furiosa absolutely does, in that it doesn't simply just try to do Fury Road all over again, which I think is why sometime some of the criticism I was reading about this film, they were like, oh, it's good, but it's not nearly as good as Fury Road. And I never went into this movie trying to compare it to Fury Road. And I think that the film makes a point to, actively work against that notion that this is just, Fury Road 2.0 or whatever, however people want to describe it. Because of the fact that, while it is an origin story about Furiosa, Fury Road is more or less Furiosa's film, right? I think that's the kind of a general consensus. So this movie is just as much about Furiosa as it is about the wasteland, which really surprised me. And it fuels the sort of notion that this is a longer film. And that really gives this movie the feeling of an odyssey.
Yes.
Not only from the fact that the first 40 minutes of the movie, or no, probably less than that, but like the first 25, 30 minutes of the movie is about Furiosa as a child. You get that chase sequence, and then it kind of flashes forward to the future. So it's not just that it's long, it's that you get to see the wasteland grow along with Furiosa. You get to see a lot more of the politics of Gastown, the Bullet Farm, Citadel. You get to meet the players and whatnot. Of course, there's, an even more expanded cast of freak warlords, which I absolutely love. The Rogues Gallery of freaks here is just amazing. And it shows, George Miller just continually is just a mastermind, I think, when it comes to this universe, and the fact that, he keeps expanding on this in really interesting and bizarre but exciting ways that just feel fitting. When you have a universe where you have Chris Hemsworth playing a guy called Dementus, and then, of course, Immortan Joe, the People Eater, Organic Mechanic, Rictus Erectus, a guy called fucking Scrotus. Like, it's a world that is just filled with oddities and weirdos. And I don't know, there's a quality to that, in that, he keeps introducing these more outlandish characters, these more outlandish sort of just happenings, or the ways in which the wasteland operates. And it all fits so perfectly. And the fact that, Furiosa, while I wouldn't say, it's able to really compete with Fury Road on an action sort of set pieces and whatnot, because it's a longer film, but there's less action set pieces than Fury Road, I think. What is there in Furiosa, though, I found to be, completely original, outside of course, you're going to have the war rigs and whatnot, and the trucks getting ambushed and things like that. But just the variables in this universe, whether it is hearkening back to, Road Warrior, when you get to see that kind of like gyrocopter, we get all of this like aerial warfare aspect, where you have these guys that are, parasailing basically while they're attached to a motorcycle. Or at one point you have a guy that's called the Octoboss, who basically has this massive octopus inflatable that hangs off the back of his motorcycle, flying around behind the war rig. And he's got these like quad AK-47s, and he's chewing through guys. Like, it builds and it builds and it builds in this ludicrous, visual vernacular that George Miller and company have created. And it's just exhilarating every time. And I think that also, Anna Taylor-Joy, she had big shoes to fill, considering, Charlize Theron playing Furiosa in Fury Road. And then Anya Taylor-Joy showed up and was like absolutely no slouch. She doesn't have as much of a background in action as, maybe Charlize Theron does, but I thought she did a really, really great job. And Chris Hemsworth, I think, probably delivers one of my favorite, if not my favorite, villain performance of the year. He's a guy that I think has been a little typecast because of course, doing a lot of Marvel stuff. He's Thor and whatnot. But he showed that he could chew scenery with the best character actors with this one role, I think. And I'm just excited to see, what else he's able to kind of do in the future. It doesn't always have to be action, but I just want to see him play more weirdos, more eccentric characters, because he does such a great job of that in this. And I'm going to shut up now because I could talk about this movie forever.
And you have talked about it on John Hayes, if people want to go listen to that episode. Yep. So you did get to talk about it at length. There you go. So, I mean, for me, the 2.5 hours flew by. As I said, it isn't the same as Fury Road. And I think if you look through all the Mad Max films, that's been the defining feature, is they all feel different from one another. in one way or another. I
Mm.
mean, while there's a connective tissue between the first three films compared to the last two, they still, you know, feel at different times and places, and that's always been the key thing. And I think here, even though I think it's recency bias that make you think of Fury Road, because of course it will. This is marketed that way. It's like it's going to be, oh, it's the follow up to that. It's a prequel to that, and that's fine. That's not a problem. But yeah, it's just a different flavor, and it's still like a really energetic, hyper sort of thing that Miller does really well. Um, you could tell he's been hanging out with Hideo Kojima more, given the ever-growing list of nut jobs with colourful names. I mean, Octopus was just like straight away. It's like you definitely, you were definitely like, yep.
Yep.
um, but yeah, it's Hemsworth is just like something else. It's great to kind of see. Sometimes you look at actors in things before they get big, and you go, "Oh, it'd be cool if they got big one day." And like it feels like a monkey's paw
Mm.
when they get given a role that kind of stifles them or changes who they are and what they are. I feel very much the same about Ryan Reynolds. It's like I always thought he was great in his younger years and kind of wished he'd become a big star. And the monkey's pouring out. It's like he is, and it's like very much like not the version of him I like in that same sense.
Mm.
But yeah, and it is just like he's been shaken out of something, and he's just been eager to take something on like this, and he just runs with it. And I think there's such confidence in people who get to work with Miller, and they really revel in what they're doing. I think it could be so easy to view Anya Taylor-Joy's role as being like derivative because she doesn't get to say much. There's not as much action and all that. But no, I think it's a very deliberate choice, and she fully embraces it as well. It's performance that is very much about facial expressions and moments, which is, I think, well, she's got a very expressive face and has been great at doing that. When you think back to The Witch, it has been something about her that has been really enchanting to see on the screen. So yeah, it's great to see her getting a role like this and really doing that. Yeah, I think, yeah, there's the odd criticism, of course, like you can see, and I think that's why it gets a chink in its armor that isn't there with like Fury Road, where it feels like flawless because it feels like this standalone thing, separate from everything else, where this has that baggage of being connected to it. And so therefore expectation
Sure.
going in is that, oh, it's going to be exactly like that. But not just, the film to film, it's like the landscape has changed in those 9 years between the two films. And I think
Mm.
the quality of CG, I think, is part of that. And I don't think that's really on George Miller, with that. And that end credits thing kind of just makes me think that was a Warner Brothers decision. And that's
Yeah.
fine. Again, these are things I don't really put at the door of George Miller. But it is to follow up a film like that and be really good. It is something just remarkable, and it is just. I think I said to you after I watched it, it's like I think I'll probably like this more and more each time I watch it. In much the
Mm.
same way I felt very steady with Fury Road from start to finish. It's like every time I watch it, it's like this just doesn't get old. This thing just keeps on giving, and yeah,
Yeah.
we're definitely out of the happy feet era of George Miller, that's for sure. I think
It still blows my mind that
just
my favorite post-apocalyptic film series is by the same guy that did the fucking
I
animated
know,
dancing penguins and Babe Pig in the City.
yeah, and the fact that he's very sincere about it. I mean, I think,
Yeah.
like I said, it's why I think he and Kojima are such good bedfellows because they just have the same sensibilities. It's like they don't mind things being a bit daft, but still managing to find emotion and in that, and depth that you wouldn't expect. If you can take all these things on the surface of and go, oh, yeah, that's stupid looking, or that doesn't look right. So, but if you're actually watching or experiencing it, you're getting something quite refreshing. When you look at the rest of the landscape, generally speaking.
Yeah.
So, on to my number four then, and I have picked The Last Stop in Yuma County. And
That's one of my later
oh,
films.
okay, all right. So we'll come back to that then. and let you go with your number three.
My number three is Love Lies Bleeding from director Rose
And that will come
Glass.
later in my list.
I knew there'd be some crossover.
And that was where it was. But I will go in with my number three, which won't be a crossover. I know this just because you haven't had it released in your country yet. But, and that is Horde by Luna Carmoon, which is a British film which stars Joseph Quinn is in it, as everyone knows of things like Stranger Things and A Quiet Place Day One. Also stars for the beginning bit Haley Squires, who's been in things such as Beau is Afraid, In Fabric, In the Earth. So, off to a good start in that sense. Uh, so it's kind of a horror story in a way, in aspects. It's a very raw and strange thing. It's a story of a teenager whose mother used to be like a hoarder, basically. And that was in the 80s, Britain sort of thing. Literally, just the house is just full of crap, and her mother freaks out if she doesn't have certain things. But they have a system, and it feels magical to the daughter Maria at the time, like it's their own special little world. And anything that sort of interrupts that makes it feel a bit upsetting. Unfortunately, it does get upset, and the hoarding comes back to bite them somewhat, and she ends up being put up for foster care. And so we come back to her in the 90s. She's about to be leaving school sort of age, and she is basically living with a foster mother now. And she meets a former foster resident, Michael, who is played by Joseph Quinn, who used to live in the same house she is in now. And he kind of understands what her life was like back then, and understands the sort of urges she's kind of kept to herself, like the idea of filth and hoarding and doing things that are viewed as abnormal, by modern society. And so they form this very strange and dangerous relationship, when you consider the age groups here of a 30-year-old man and presumably we're going 18, I think, for safety here in terms of that. But yeah, that aspect of it is like the middle third of this film really just takes you by surprise, because the first part is basically flashback of the mother and daughter, and just you kind of understand how they've got this magical connection, even though it's really horrible. There's there's a thing they have, like like it's a stoat or something, a pet stoat, and this like a weasel, and it gets lost around the house all the time because the house is in such a state. So like they say, "Oh, I haven't seen it for days," sort of thing. It's a very gruesome scene of them, like where she falls down in like a pile of rubbish and feels something horrible and gooey, and it's
Oh,
it's a
jeez.
dead thing that's been long dead, and
Yeah.
it's not, it's a rat king, which is the very same meaning of like a bunch of dead rats that have all sort of died together. Um, yeah, that was just the way that's dealt with is so matter of fact. It's really quite something. But yeah, you can see that the mother has troubles and is clearly not doing well with this. I mean, like I said, she freaks out if things go out of order. And yeah, like I said, that kind of ends badly. And we do that skip forward. The 90s section of it was another in recent films where I just felt a real flavor for 90s Britain, because that's something I've lived through. The 80s I was like a child, like an actual child, whereas I was getting into my teens in the 90s, and I have a better recollection of what that was like. And this, the found footage film Exhibit A and After Sun, which stars Paul Mescal, three films that really just kind of nailed really specific things about the 90s in Britain. And I said about this film, I felt so weirdly connected to this, but not in a direct way, but just these myriad smaller instances. And what I love with all three is that they are totally distinct now they do that, but I still feel that I recognize something in each, which is quite similar. Like I said, strange middle part. It's worth persevering though, because the end message of it is of acceptance, and it's kind of sweet in its own way, despite all the fucked up things that start happening, yeah, at one point.
Mm.
It's a very strange little film in a lot of ways, but I am completely smitten with it. It would just blew me away. I can't remember who recommended. I think it was a film critic sort of mentioned it in their listings, and I was like, sounds interesting, without really getting all the context until you watch it. But yeah, it is something else. Yeah, there's so many surprises anyway in this list for me, but yeah, this was something just truly special because it was odd and felt again weirdly nostalgic.
Well, I think that that's like the beauty of film, right? Not to get all on soapbox about the magic of cinema, but like that is, I think, a quality of movies that always surprises me
Mm,
sometimes when I'm watching something, and it's like it could have a premise that I have no um, sort of relationship with or experience with personally, but if you are still able to tell a story within a time period or an environment or fill that world with relatable characters, then all of a sudden I can begin to still have a connection to this
mm,
film that's deeper, despite the fact that, you know, the subject matter might be something I've never experienced and on any level, right? Something like hoarding, like I've never experienced that, but who's to say that if I watch it, there won't be characters or something that I start to see, you know, maybe comparisons between people in my own life or things like that. So I think that's just one of those things where it's like, you know, while a majority of my list is genre focused, at the same time, if you have something that is a drama, I'm certainly not going to be like, well, you know, I'll get to it when I get to it. I got more genre stuff to watch, right? I think that's kind of just, again, like the beauty of genre and that it can be as relatable or completely unrelatable, but, you know, on some level, you will more than likely find an aspect that kind of resonates with you, however slight or however much it
yeah.
does.
I noticed as well a weird coincidence with this. I think four out of my top five are first-time feature-length directors as well, which is telling. I mean, and
Hmm.
yeah, even the other one, Rose Glass, it's like a sophomore effort. So yeah, it just
Yeah.
shows the freshness of ideas and getting these very unique voices to just come out of the gate with something really fascinating that connects. I think naturally that gets lost. I think the more directors get to do things and they're in the system, they are going to lose a bit of that spark and that anger. We see that with so many directors over the years in all types.
Mm.
So yeah, there is just something exciting about finding something brand new in that way. But that was my number three, and we're on your number three now. No, your number two. Sorry, yeah, your number two.
Usually I'm the one on
Yeah.
Safe Room that does that. So
The double switch threw me off.
yeah. Well, my number two is a film that you already mentioned, and it was your number
Yeah,
four. My number two is Last Stop in Yuma County from Francis Gillespie. Is that how you say that?
Gallipy,
I'm
Gallipy. I think
naturally
it's
also
Gallipy. Gallipy.
Gillespie. All right. But this was a film that, you know, I believe I only knew about because of you. You recommended it to me. And this was a movie that, you know, on paper is very simplistic, but at the same time, I think the simplicity is what makes this
Mm.
really stand out because of the fact that you get to see a first time director prove that, you know, a film to be good does not have to have a super complex premise. And at the same time, like a directorial debut does not have to be, you know, the next evolution of cinema. No, you could play around with genre in a way that is incredibly true to the subgenre in which, you know, your film is occupying. But at the same time, you know, channeling influences that clearly this film has, and doing just like a stellar job of understanding those influences and better yet, you know, the execution of them. And so this is a film where a great deal of people come together at a rest stop and they basically become stranded as the gas truck has had a delay of sorts. And so you have this eclectic group of characters that begin meeting up at this diner and whatnot. And then naturally, you have two bank robbers that show up, and, you know, the sort of predicament of, okay, these guys that are criminals are there, and you've got these other people who, you know, some of them are shady, some of them are just, you know, average people, and seeing this sort of like powder keg and melting pot of personalities come together. It's the type of film that, you know, right off the bat, I kind of clocked it as being very Coen Brothers esque
Mm,
in sort of the blending of dark humor, but at the same time, the propensity for violence being at just a moment's notice away, and at the same time, it being very brutal when it does actually unfold. Um, this was a movie that I just learned had $1 million budget, which I think is outstanding for how it
yeah,
looks. The fact that you have, again, like a great deal of, I would say, indie character
yeah,
actors that are in this one. And some of my personal favorites of recent memory. You've got Jim Cummings, you have Sierra McCormick, Jocelyn Donahue, of course, the great Richard Brake, who I love seeing in this movie because he actually feels like he's given a lot more to work with on screen. He's not just a cameo here, a couple of lines there. He's in a good chunk of this film and is able to kind of like shine through in a big way. And there was one other person. Oh yeah, Alex Esso, who
yeah.
again is like one of these indie horror darlings that I always love seeing when they pop up, and to see some of these people that are primarily in horror films be in something that is not horror.
Mm,
At first, I was kind of like, that's interesting. I can't say that I've experienced that with some of these people, and so to see them kind of like come in and fill these very like scenery chewing kind of I would say prototypical character actor type roles, but everybody leaves a distinguishing mark on the film and adds to the powder keg of the situation they're in a meaningful way. And then, of course, in typical Coen Brothers fashion, when that powder keg explodes, it's done so with a humorous flair and brutal violence, which is a recipe for success more often than not. When I'm thinking about successful films that deal with crime thrillers and things of that nature. So yeah, I really really enjoyed this one, and it was one that you obviously recommended it to me. So going into it, I was like, yeah, I think I'll probably get on with this pretty well. That's usually a good sort of barometer for whether or not I'll enjoy something if you've recommended it to me. But it blew me away. I think it just how refined it felt, and at the same time, just how well it channeled some of those influences that I mentioned.
yeah. I think since sort of getting into film reviewing since last year, I've taken very much the same approach I did when I was doing video game reviews, which is like if someone offers up the chance to do something for something that sounds interesting but is out of my normal wheelhouse, I generally want to take it. I mean, this Riddle
Hmm.
of Fire are two examples. You know. So as a result, a lot of the films in my top 10 came out of nowhere, and I like that mainly because it's always a treat to sort of go in blind on something that hasn't already been widely hyped or dismissed already. Yeah, and I think this is like the greatest example of that for me this year. Yeah, it's just got, as you said, this Western flavored neo noir thing, and yeah, it's a very strong debut. Yeah, it's got all these strong performances. Yeah, like you said, Jim Cummings is, I think, low key. I think every time he turns up in anything, I'm interested straight away. It's like without me ever
Hmm.
thinking he's like a favorite actor or anything. It's just he has something about him that works. Richard Brake again, yeah, like you, I did like that he actually got more to do in this one. A nice little Barbara Crampton cameo as well, which was yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. As you said, the amount of horror sort of lineage in this is really fascinating. I mean, Jocelyn Donahue as well, who's was in House of the Devil and in Doctor Sleep. She's the waitress, and yeah, I think it's just something about that genre kind of works well in an adjacent genre if you have a lot of actors from it because they all have the same understanding going into it. And it has horror sensibilities, I think, without it ever being a horror. And I think that's maybe what makes it take that basic formula and really push it into this really dynamic, interesting direction. And I think nowhere is that more true than with Cummings. So I think just, he's got this great character arc in this and really gets to be an imperfect character in the best way. And yeah, that's all I'm going to say on that. Because that's it. But yeah, like you said, everyone just has something, a moment. I mean, even like Nicholas Logan, plays Richard Brake's like sort of henchman type guy, like that. He was just, he was a great sort of, stooge sort of performance. Everyone's just understands what they're doing. I think. Like I'd seen Gene Jones in Also a Ty West film. Yeah, he was in that one about the cult that I can't remember the name of right now. The Sacrament. Yeah, he's in that. It's like, so yeah, even he has like a horror thing, and he's worked with the Coens as well. So it's like, it's I can't quite think what I was thinking here. It was when I'd finished watching it, I was like, yeah, I really enjoyed that. It was really tight. I don't know. The more I thought about it afterwards, or just thinking, the more I think about it, the more impressive it was, because you could clearly tell that there was not much to it in terms of like budget and time. It was just the constraints of it work so well, and why that is could be whether that's because of pandemic or whatever, or just budgetary reasoning. It just felt like great use of whatever the reason was, like that. Again, not the only film I have in my top five, I think, where you see a small budget and you see the imagination and creativity used in it to make something that feels as polished and stellar as something more highly revered and with a bigger budget and bigger names. So yeah, again, another weird coincidence with this our lists. There's another director who's going to go and make an Evil Dead film after this, and I'm again very intrigued because he's done the classic Evil Dead formula in a way of like people confined into one area, turning against each other. So yeah, that again, he's going into horror. So maybe this was all that took to convince him. All these horror people. But yeah, again, fantastic debut. Just a fantastic film. I said at the time, it's like I wouldn't be surprised they're still on my top films of the year by the end of the year. And that was a few months ago, and it's still up here in those films. So that brings me on to number two, which I think was your number three, wasn't it? Which is Love Lies Bleeding. Yeah, which is the sophomore effort from Rose Glass, who did Saint Maud, which I loved, and it was the main reason I wanted to watch this film was because of her direction in that film, and especially what she achieved in like her final shot of that film, which is just one of the all-timer best finishing shots to a film in horror, that without a doubt. But this is when we were just talking there about like having this horror connection in a film that is a crime movie. Like this again, it very much has almost like a Cronenberg-esque nature to it without being a Cronenberg film. Basic story here is this reclusive gym manager called Lou, played by Kristen Stewart. Clearly has a bit of a shitty life, lives out in the middle of nowhere, everything's terrible. But she meets this bodybuilder woman, Jackie, played by Katie O'Brien, and they kind of they fall in love / lust and steroid abuse as it goes, and sort of end up conspiring to commit some crimes by accident. And you don't really want to get too far into that, but basically they're not good for each other's lives is the best way to put it, but they are at the same time. And this is a film that is very symbolic of the toxicity of love, even when it can be good for you in some ways. Not every relationship is right for you, I suppose is the best way to put it. And the outcome of their sort of relationship is just everything bad. It's like in a way that you wouldn't expect as well, which I think going into it, it felt like it was going to be like a heist sort of movie. I don't know, from what I'd seen of images and stuff like that. I hadn't looked at trailers really at all because, like I said, it was a Rose Glass movie. I was absolutely going to watch it, whatever. But yeah, again, this is another one which has like a really interesting cast, even beyond the main two. I think Dave Franco really just leaning into that Franco douchebaggery in the best way. Jenna Malone, doing her usual like, oh, Jenna Malone's in this sort of thing, and just Ed Harris. I mean, man, like I don't remember the last time I was invested in an Ed Harris performance, and
Yeah.
it's just fantastic. I think it was probably Mother, briefly, but
Yeah.
he's just sinister and horrible in the best possible way. Now, I think it has to go down to those two performances at the front, though. Kristen Stewart and Katie O'Brien. I mean, just beyond brilliant together. I mean, Katie O'Brien, I think we probably both agree, is the star of the show here in terms of like who has like the most coming out of this film. And she is just this proper bundle of muscle, anxiety, and energy, and at the same time managed to feel like cool and calm and collected in another moment. And she's just like a really fascinating character. I mean, like I said, barely looked at reviews, didn't so much as look at a trailer, knew what I was involved with it being rose glass, and yeah, that was enough. It's sublime. I think the decisions Glass makes in this movie are stupendous. Beyond the leads and all that, it's just that score by Clint Mansell, which I said to you is just like the most John Carpenter score that isn't by John Carpenter that I've heard. And just some of the shots in this are like, you can tell it's like someone who's reveling in having a sophomore film rather than that sort of nervous apprehension of, oh shit, people are going to expect me to top what I did before. I think there was enough wiggle room in St. Maud that you get to this and you could do anything like that. And yeah, she does anything. And I think there's shots in this, like the muscle shots and like the body horror nature of the way they're done. I'm totally taken aback. I say the Cronenberg stuff because there are just a few scenes in this that are just straight out of a Cronenberg film without feeling like a homage. They just have that same intensity and repulsive but enchanting sort of feel to them that I think only Cronenberg really does that well, like that. So for Rose Glass to really get and make it her own still in a way, just knocked me for six. But I know you love this film as well. So what do you love about this film?
No, I agree largely with everything that you've said. I think Katie O'Brien is fantastic, and she juggles what could have been a very sort of straightforward, very simplistic kind of persona, but she makes her characters, passion and drive infectious,
Yeah.
right? And you kind of seeing her spiraling and seeing what she's willing to do and sacrifice and, put her body through to achieve her goal, and, what she's willing to do to other people as much as, she's willing to do to herself, is quite palpable. And it's the type of thing where, while she is very much the, the star of the film, somebody like Kristen Stewart, I mean, if Kristen Stewart wasn't there, and she's probably one of the most consistent like character actors of the last few years that doesn't necessarily get categorized as such, but her ability to like slip into these roles that more often than not, between this and something like Underwater, these kind of these outsiders, almost kind of these people that aren't quite sure where they fit into whichever society the current film is taking place in, right? Kind of trying to find their place and whatnot, and seeing her play against O'Brien's character is just, fantastic. And getting to see, these two odd puzzle pieces kind of be fitting together, while, initially, the lust of their relationship is fantastic for the two of them. Of course, you get to see sort of the toxicity that stems from that. And just because two puzzle pieces fit together doesn't mean that they're, truly the right pieces for one another. I was also really just impressed with, Rose Glass's ability to blend subgenres. So, while this is very much from the outside, just like this crime drama film, the fact that you're able to have those kinds of like horror influences, but they're used at the exact right moments. Rose Glass's previous film, St. Maud, as you mentioned, of course, being a horror film, psychological horror film at that, this film still has elements of psychological horror to it, but the film is not defined by that. If anything, she shows a great deal of restraint and exactly executes with those moments and some of this ethereal imagery that really emphasizes the thematic nuances and tones of Love Lies Bleeding, which, like you, I didn't watch any of the trailers or anything. I didn't read into it other than, okay, cool, this is a crime movie where Dave Franco looks like an extraordinary douchebag. it's the thing where that type of imagery, though, really is horrifying in those
Mm.
instances. And it does such a great job of feeling fitting for what Rose Glass is trying to say and, discuss again with those thematic nuances and tones. It just ends up being a film that, you know, it's to most people, it probably sounds pretty weird when you try to describe it all. And you know
Yeah.
what? It's the type of movie where it's like you just have to see it to get it. And it fits together so well, and it feels so well realized. And like you said, even somebody like Ed Harris, who he's fine most of the time. It's not like one of my favorite actors. At the same time, he's not somebody that I've ever have really taken issue with in terms of like their role or contribution to a movie. But like even somebody like him, he shows up and just leaves a mark on this film in such a memorable way. Whether it's the way that he looks or just sort of his deadpan delivery and the sinisterness behind what he's saying, despite the fact that he doesn't have to raise his voice a majority of the film. It feels like a very unique take on what on paper sounds very simplistic, and doing so through Rose Glass's like very singular sort of visual style. And as you said, that soundtrack does so much heavy
Mm.
lifting, I think, in supporting not only that sort of surreal imagery that's in the film, but that's what allows you to never really forget sort of the fact that Rose Glass, is going to be able to approach these things in a very unique way. It kind of just makes you a little uneasy throughout the entire film, no matter what's happening on screen. And it made for a movie that I assumed I would go into it liking, but I really, really ended up loving this movie in a way I never thought I would.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I said, it's weird how sometimes you'll just see something about a movie and the stars just align to make you go, I'm gonna watch that whatever. Like that. Like my only
Mm.
regret I think was I didn't see it while it was in cinema. But I rarely like pre-order like big films digitally. But it's like I did with this because it's like I ain't gonna see it any other way soon otherwise. And the confidence to just say, yeah, I'm fine with that. It was, yeah. So yeah, and I'm definitely getting myself a nice 4K or Blu-ray this as soon as I can as well. Because
Mm.
yeah, it's just one of those that yeah, it's even though I didn't know what to expect going in, I did in the sense of like I knew I would want to like it. And
Mm.
considering what it's about, a lot of it's very odd to think that that's the case. But yeah, it works so well. Love it. Absolutely fantastic stuff. So we've got to our number ones, but before we do, let's just have a little recap. Jay, if you could go from your 5 to 2.
Yeah, my 5 to 2 was Infested. And then I had Furiosa, a Mad Max saga for my number 4, Love Lies Bleeding for my number 3. My number 2 was Last Stop in Yuma County.
There you go. My number 5 was Riddle of Fire. My number 4 was Last Stop in Yuma County. My number 3 was Horde, and my number 2 was Love Lies Bleeding. So we are at the end of the road, and time to see, did we pick the same film or are they separate films? We shall find out. Jay, what is your number one film so far of 2024?
Well, being the genre guy, there was no horror film that I could put on my list other than Longlegs for my number 1 from Osgood
There you
Perkins.
go. Not my number, but there you go. So, but
Yeah,
yeah,
it was in your
it
honorable
was.
mentions, I
Yes,
think,
it
right?
was.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so this was a film that there has been a incredible amount of hype around, right? You had the typical, which is becoming even more frequent, sort of media hubbub around the film where, the scariest film ever made, people are fainting, people are, shitting their spines in the theater at how scary it is. And while I did not lose control of my bodily fluids while watching this film, it is my favorite horror film of the year so far. It's my favorite film of the year so far, for a number of reasons. But for anybody who is unaware, this film follows FBI agent Lee Harker, who's played by Micah Monroe, and she is pursuing a serial killer case. And the serial killer in question is named Longlegs, who's played by Nicolas Cage. And, very clearly from the outset, this is not your traditional serial killer
No.
case. You have entire families that are being murdered in horrific ways, and the killer has not left any physical evidence at any of the murder scenes. And it's been going on for, I think it was like a decade or something like that. So, right from the start, Osgood Perkins is a filmmaker that I am about 50-50 on. Not all of his films have worked for me, but at the same time, I think it's undeniable that even a film like I Am the Pretty Thing That Lives in the House, which I personally did not care for, he still has this quality of really getting under your skin. And I know that that's kind of like a generic way to describe a dread-inducing horror film, but he has this way of crafting an atmosphere that is so uncomfortable. And not just because, he plays around with cameras lingering in liminal spaces a lot or anything like that. It's just, he has this quality of really debasing you in a certain environment and just, makes it feel like something is occupying that space, even when it's not. And what I'll say is that Longlegs is by far his most accessible film, I think. Even something like Gretel and Hansel, which is much more straightforward than something like Blackcoat's Daughter, or I Am the Pretty Thing That Lives in the House, that film still has a very surreal quality to it that I don't think is approachable for, let's say general audiences. I think a lot of people that I know that saw that are not as hardcore of horror fans as us said things like, I don't know, man, that movie is just like really weird. And I didn't really get what they were doing. But with Longlegs, while it is a much more straightforward premise, at the same time, he has not skimped on his ability to like sow dread. And I think that is indicative right from the cold open of the film, which I'm not going to break down, but I will say that, the cold open does such a good job of being traditionally terrifying, but in a very untraditional way. He plays around with like aspect ratio, and I'll leave it at that. But I think that he has such a good job of making somebody uncomfortable again with just that liminal space. And, the absence of overt horror really gets under your skin because of the anticipation of what is coming, what as the audience, you're going to be terrified with or confronted with. And he does such a great job, I think, also of like drawing influence and blending those influences. You wrote an article for comingsoon.net, which was about, how this film draws a great deal of influence from The Exorcist 3, right? Amongst other things, something like Cure, or even surprisingly, anybody that has played Alan Wake 2. There's a lot of parallels, I think, in terms of, blending what on the surface might seem like a traditional sort of serial killer case with the supernatural, and the way that Oz Perkins is able to create this sort of, swimmy, almost, psychosis between the killer and the FBI agent that's hunting them. And, there's like a little bit of like X-Men superpowers there, but it's done in a way that is a lot more dread inducing. And, the film itself, why I think that you gave such a good shout to like Exorcist 3, and that the movie feels like it is a straightforward, detective procedural for the first half of the film in terms of structure, not in terms of like the case being easy to decipher or anything like that. But I found that was such a smart direction to take with Longlegs before you get into the more overt supernatural aspects of it, because you're able to sell this killer and this world in a way that feels very grounded, that I think really allows the gruesomeness of the crime scenes and the gruesomeness of the crimes themselves to really be palpable for the audience, the disgust that these characters have in being a part of this case. And I think that Osgood Perkins very smartly focuses on, when you get to the more supernatural stuff, it's more about the influence of the devil rather than, what the devil is able to do himself, kind of a thing, like the actual acts, which I find to be, as somebody that, personally, religious horror or satanic horror is not typically something that really bothers me or something that scares me. The idea, though, of the influence that you could have over another person and cause them to do something horrific to the ones they love, I found to be profoundly disturbing in the way that Perkins goes about that. And, last thing I'll say is just this film is stacked with fantastic performances. Basically, every single mainstay character is fantastic, from Micah Monroe, who plays a character that, you might be able to say is like kind of straightforward in being a detective that, perhaps has some kind of outsider qualities, whether those be, some autistic qualities or not, just the way in which she feels like an outsider really allows the audience themselves to like resonate with her because we are an outsider in this world and just the horrors of this case. And then of course you have Nicolas Cage, who once again, really leans into his ability to be this fantastic character actor that at the same time continually surprises in just how effective he can be. And then you have Alicia Witt, fantastic. We don't want to get too much into, her role in this film because it really is stellar. But then you have even Blair Underwood, who plays Micah Monroe's boss, like really strong character. And even Kiernan Shipka, who is not in a great deal of the film. She's only in one scene, but she's able to steal that scene and really take charge and command of it in a way that, by the end of the film, when I was doing my tally of like people that were memorable, she's only in it for about 5 minutes and she gives one of the most memorable performances in the film. So yeah, again, like good on also Neon, I think, for, the distributor of this film. The marketing for this movie I thought was fantastic. As somebody that doesn't watch trailers for movies primarily because they don't want to have anything spoiled or whatnot, their ability to capture the feel of this movie,
Yes.
even through, just the posters or, some of the stills that they released. I felt that outside of the trailers, they didn't release a single thing that gave anything away to the degree that, some other horror films might have in terms of just showing their hand a little too much in what was in store for audiences. And so, yeah, that's my ranting and raving on Longlegs, my favorite film of the year.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
far.
yeah. Like I said, I think it's one of those films that when I get back to it again, I'm going to appreciate it even more again. I mean, in the week or two since I reviewed it on Letterboxd, so obviously it kept coming to me in my mind. It's why I've written a couple of articles about it because it just was there in my mind, thinking I've got to say something about it. The other article I did was about how they kind of subvert the idea of the serial killer movie and how Perkins doesn't glamorize this serial killer, yet he's still intimidating, disturbing, and worrying as well. But he's also just fucking ridiculous and like pathetic in a way that is so you just don't get to see. It does set you up for the Silence of the Lamb comparisons in those early times, but much like the Exorcist 3, it does go into more of the whole conduit of evil sort of thing, where it's like someone with delusions of grandeur sort of thing. And so that made me appreciate Cage's sort of performance in this more. I think he gets such a bad rap because of the expectation of what a Nicolas Cage performance is, that it's a very vague sort of wishy-washy. Oh, he's doing his crazy Nick Cage thing again. It's like
Right.
he's performing. That's always the point. He's always performing. He's not really acting in the sense of like, oh, I'm going to be all super serious. He's putting something into a character, and that's why it always feels louder, in a lot of cases. And here it's like he understands his own mannerisms and the way he tweaks them to make them feel just like absurd and unsettling because no matter what he does, it's just clearly what's made him such, already a really memorable, memeable character in terms of I was saying to you, the amount of stuff that's come through about literally about singing that song. And I
Yeah.
have been creeping my daughter out for the last week or two by doing that little monologue from the beginning of the film, like about my put my long legs on. Like she doesn't even have context of the film, and she's freaked out. So it's not, yeah, it's just. I mean, there's that. Like I said in my review, I think it's got this doomy feeling to it. This early rumblings of end times, which is why The Exorcist 3 again comes into mind. Because I watched that film for the first time like a week before this as well, which made everything feel a lot fresher in its connection. But yeah, that use of space as well, I think, is another great connective thing as well. Just when you think of The Exorcist 3's big, moment, in terms of like cinematic history, it's like that is the greatest example of like anticipation and use of space in a jump scare. So Longlegs definitely carries a lot of that. Yeah, I mean, like all of Perkins' films, it is a visually striking one. like that. But I think,
Yeah.
as you pointed out, the big difference I find here is the characters are more like characters, like people, and more
Mm.
interesting. And even though they're very different, and even if you take them individually, they don't all feel equal. I mean, it'd be very easy for this movie to be drowned out by Nicolas Cage. He clearly understands that that's not necessary, and that they use him sparingly, and that's really effective. But Michael Monroe always has that sort of detached nature to her in certain moments that has worked in this genre. I think when you think of It Follows, as much as she did a lot of screaming and running, she also just had these moments of being like she was detached from what was going on and feeling a bit distant, and that's what made that performance work in the context of that film, because it was so dreamlike and weird and not real at times, that it made sense that she would be like that. And even stuff on it that's a bit lighter, like Villains with Bill Skarsgård, she has
Mm.
moments like that. And yeah, so again, the fact that she was in this was like an instant like watch for me, because I think she's great. But yeah, it was a performance I did not expect from her still, in terms of like how sort of reserved it was and how little she had to do to be able to sort of convey these emotions. And without, like you say, giving away anything about Alicia Witt, I'm a long time fan of her, and just seeing her in the film and the performance she puts in, it's just like, I mean, for me, she is like the standout. Like, she is just, and you wouldn't expect that going in. That is just,
Yeah.
but she is fantastic. Um, yeah, it's funny that you said about the Alan Wake stuff, considering Os Perkins has pretty much denounced anything modern in terms of like horror. So,
Mm.
so I'm guessing he hasn't played Alan Wake.
Sure.
But even like the casual diss of not watching Ty West films, and like there's at least two scenes in this
Yeah.
where you go, really? You don't watch Ty West films?
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I think small problems like ever with Perkins films with the writing occasionally, but it's minimal, and it has the atmosphere, it has the mood. It's just a vibe. I mean, I watched this in the cinema at like basically midnight, and then came out of it listening to a horror book on audio book and walking home at like 2 in the morning. So on a Saturday night. So yeah, I got
Oh
the full
man,
experience. So
braver than me.
yeah, it was but yeah, it was great to sort of be able to stew on a film at that time, and knowing you'd have to rush back and you just sort of chill in. And yeah, it was a great thing. I'm so glad I got to see it in cinemas. I just think front to back, it just does some really cool things. I think strong opening, strong end. That end scene is just as strong as the opening scene, I think, in terms of just it's got that same mix of Cage's absurdity, like that, whilst being disturbing, even with the context. So yeah, it is. It's in my top 10. I think at the minute, but her rewatch, I think, may push it further up, depending on what else comes out, of course, this year. But yeah, I'm glad that Perkins has gone beyond just sheer vibes and now actually has a bit more substance to it. Because yeah, like you, I don't, I haven't loved any of his films. I've found them
Mm.
interesting, and I'm very interested to see what he's basically doing a more comedic horror with the monkey next as well. So that in itself was like,
Mm.
okay, now I'm very interested in that. So yeah, it's nice to see that he's finally sort of found his vibe. And I don't know, something about his interviews in the weeks after the film's release has made me very much think of John Carpenter in just terms of like that I don't give a fuck sort of and I have a very rigid
Yeah.
set of views on what I do and don't like, without ever sounding like an arsehole, but just kind of sound like I don't care. But I mean, I could go into a whole other thing about it, but just stuff about his description of why he doesn't like modern horror, and just like because of the way his dad's
Mm.
late career went. Just it's cool to see someone who sticks to their guns, at least I suppose. And I don't think you'd get a
Mm.
film like this if you didn't. You know. Yeah. So yeah, Long Legs, fresh in everyone's mind anyway. But yeah, it is a fantastic film. So we are on to my number one, um, which is Mike Cheslick's Hundred of Beavers. Um,
Mm.
yes. Now, when I talk about surprises, um, this was literally, I think, a PR sent an email through about like for a promo for it, just to sort of advertise it was coming to theaters or something. And I watched the trailer and I was like, this looks amazing. Like this looks like something I'd really enjoy because it's everything from silent cinema to classical slapstick like Buster Keaton, Charlie Chaplin, that sort of stuff, mixed with Looney Tunes nonsense. And as I would find out later, just the same sort of nonsense as Ryland Brixton Cole chooses the Lake Michigan Monster, which he's the star in this and he was the star in that, but he directed that film. Um, where it's basically low budget, like they've made the best use of a bunch of mascot costumes, and instead of hiring lots of extras, they've just duplicated that and drawn in the rest, in places and stuff like that. And to sort of look at it at a glance, you would think, oh, that looks very cheap and like unusual. Maybe that's not going to be any good. But when a film like does that and understands what it is and really leans into it, oh boy, does it pay off. So,
Mm.
for context and story here, the story as it is basically 19th century America, drunken Applejack salesman. He's so drunk that he's having these big parties. Some beavers take revenge by gnawing the legs of his big Applejack stands, which basically burn down his entire crop of apples and leave him basically for dead in the now snowy wilderness. And what follows is basically a survival video game in movie form, where he basically is hungry, needs to kill things to live, can't do it very well. It's Wile E. Coyote level stuff of like failing to kill animals, and every animal in this film is either hand drawn or a person in an animal costume. And just to lend to that absurdity. And yeah, so basically he goes from there to finds love basically with a fur trapper's daughter, whose hand he can't win unless he basically kills hundreds of beavers. And yeah, just to point out, the actual title of this movie doesn't come out up until about half an hour before the end, I think, which is like got to be up there as a record thing. But yeah, and I think even like the credits before that come up like half an hour into the film, so it's like there's a big gap between the whole spiel and the end titles, which is again just a wild thing. I'm not joking when I say it is like a Looney Tunes cartoon. Just like they go in physics, in style, in the slapstick thing. It is 100 mile an hour in terms of how it goes with its joke output, in sight gags and things like that. I mean, it really is a
Mm.
throwback in so many ways to the idea of just like, here's a gag, didn't like that one, here's another. And yeah, I've watched it 1.5 times the last day again because it came on digital over here, and
Mm.
pre-ordered the Blu-ray. So you can tell I like this one, and I just didn't expect to be so enamored with something like this. It just slapstick fast in the best way, and
Mm.
to describe it is difficult because of that. In a way, there's just so many little jokes in this that are either puerile in the best way or just straight up like classic. And like, how did you come up with that? How did you sort of convey that? And yeah, I think again it starts at a decent pace with the gags, and then by the end it just goes wild with them. It's just nuts. And yeah, it's all black and white, not silent per se, because there's sound. Rylan talks a lot without ever really saying words much. He just sort of makes exclamations here and there. yes, there's so much I could say, but not with this one. It is, but yeah, it is just lunacy, like an hour and 50 minutes of just cartoonish lunacy. And yeah, rewatches have not dulled my feelings on that. It is just perfect in what it does. And yeah, I think it's going to be a strong contender to still be up here by the end of the year. And definitely one of my favorites, I think, of this decade as well, because yeah, it does everything that I found funny about Lake Michigan Monster, but more. Like that. I know obviously different
Mm.
directors, but in terms of like that role, he was his name's such a mouthful. Ryland Brixton Cole Hughes. Yeah, in that film is a very talkative character and like very old timey here. It just he's got a natural knack for the slapstick humor and yeah,
Mm.
don't know what else to say about it beyond that. It is just it's
Yeah.
Bugs Bunny by way of Buster Keaton.
I mean, that's a pretty great elevator pitch for this film. And this is absolutely something I'm going to have you back on Genre Haze to chat about in some depth because, like you said, just from, you describing it, but I've obviously been looking at the images and trailer for it online. It's the type of thing where, if this was the type of film that I personally stumbled upon, I would probably pass on this just based off of how it looks. But the way that you're talking about it and just me knowing, your interest in film and your likes with film, like this has to be the type of film that looks ridiculous, but it nails the joke 100% of the time because it's the type of thing that looks so ridiculous, that looks so farcical that, either the jokes work or they don't. And just based on how you've talked about it, like this is very clearly one of those creative passion projects that's so fucking bizarre that it couldn't have come from any other creative team than the people behind this film. That they just know what they set out to do, and they apparently achieve that. And it's the type of thing where when you say like Looney Tunes by way of Buster Keaton, I'm just like, oh shit, okay, cool. Let's see how that gag goes and how they run with that. And I haven't seen their previous film, The Lake Michigan Monster, but it's definitely one that I just saw is on like Tubi and stuff over here. So I'll watch that to get an idea kind of their humor sensibilities. But yeah, no, this is one that I remember you covering when it was initially released, and it's certainly one that I'm going to get around to watching before the year's out.
Yeah, and I think a good few tens of thousands of people have reviewed it since I did, and at the time, his review score was like 3.94, and it's gone to 4.2 on Letterboxd now. So it's like it's really getting people in the same way, which I'm so relieved to see in a way. As much as you kind of want it to be like this special thing that only you know, but it's like even at then, it was like there was plenty of people who'd watched it from festival circuit and gone like, "This is amazing. I'd love to have seen this on the big screen," but it was like the nearest cinema that had it was for one day in London. And it was like, yeah, I love it, but maybe not enough to go spend all that money just to watch it, sort of thing. A common problem with smaller films, unfortunately. Here. But yeah, that is just a great one. I'd be glad to come on John Hayes and speak about that. Maybe even double feature it with Lake Michigan because I think those two go together nicely. Yeah, but that's that. Thank you so much for being on and discussing these films with me. It's been an absolute blast to sort of chat about a few things, out loud rather than writing them all down. Yeah, because like, as much as we do that occasionally, in between recording other podcasts, but it is just fleeting normally. So yeah, to get this has been a pleasure.
Yeah, no, man. I always enjoy chatting film with you, regardless of genre. It's the type of thing where it's like, especially this being an example of like you've given me, films that wasn't even aware of, and now they're kind of like been pushed to the top of my queue before the end of the year to check them out. So yeah, I always appreciate the opportunity to come on and revel in our love of film, whether it be genre films or otherwise. But yeah, man, it's always a blast.
Thank you. Hopefully be back with another episode soon-ish. Maybe not in the very near future, but hopefully get the ball rolling again on regular episodes soon. Now we've got this one done and dusted. But yeah, until then, go and find your own Punch Drunk Loves.